Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. We're in a season of Lent in 2026, and it seemed only appropriate that we would turn to someone as a conversation partner today who could help lead us into some devotional practices that would help us move into the season of Lent in a deeper way. For that reason, I couldn't be more delighted to be able to have Professor David F. Ford as our guest on Conversing today. David Ford, OBE, is Regius Professor of Divinity Emeritus in the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Selwyn College. Alongside continuing work on Christian theology and on interfaith relations, Professor Ford's current research includes work on the Gospel of John, the theme of glorification, theology, modernity and the arts, scriptural reasoning, contemporary worldviews, and other issues. He has published in 2021 his most recent substantial commentary written over a very long period of time and a rich harvest called The Gospel of John, a Theological Commentary. Today, in our conversation, we're going to be focusing on a more recent book that gleans from the commentary on John in a book entitled Meeting God in John, Inspiration and Encouragement from the Fourth Gospel. David Ford, welcome to Conversing. I consider it such an honor and gift to have you with us today.
Well, it's very good indeed to be here with you.
One of the things that we hold in common is that we had the same doctoral supervisor, which was a man named Stephen Sykes, who greatly affected both of our lives. And I'm just really delighted that there was a period of time in your work when you were actually in the chair that he had occupied earlier, and then to be, as his student, to become later his successor. I just think is a really wonderful, wonderful thing. Today we're going to be discussing, as I've said, the book that you've recently published called Meeting God in John, Inspiration and Encouragement from the Fourth Gospel. So it seems to me only too appropriate that we should start with a reading of the prologue, the opening verses of the Gospel of John. Could you begin us in that way, please?
Yes, it's in the NRSV version. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.'" From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law, indeed, was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known.
As you and I both believe, those verses are some of the most remarkable and beautiful verses anywhere in the Bible. And they are words that introduce us to one of the most profound portions of Scripture, the Gospel of John. For our listeners' sake, there are, of course, we all know that there's 4 Gospels. 3 Gospels are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John is a separate Gospel. And the magnificence of his language, the way that he describes the ministry and life of Jesus, the way that he invites us as readers into an understanding of what God has shown us in Jesus is what your book, your commentary on John, which is a scholarly work, and this more recent book are trying to convey to us. When you hear those words, as familiar as you are, having spent years and years and years devoted to the Gospel of John, what happens to you when you read those words and let them just be absorbed? I'm just curious.
They're still just amazing. I mean, I think the most fundamental thing about the Gospel of John for me is that you can reread and reread and reread, and the levels go on deepening and deepening, that
Yes.
It never comes to an end.
Yes, yes. It frames the gospel itself, but it also is, of course, in one sense, a frame of reality, of all reality that's being given to us in those opening verses. And one of the things that struck me about the way that you treat John in meeting God in John is that John is like an environment, a theological and spiritual ecosystem in which you are inviting us to both dwell and let it dwell in us. I wonder if you could just talk about that sense of the embrace, the total embrace that the Gospel of John is, and why it has this very distinctive power.
Oh, my goodness, yes. It's partly how John writes it, of course. He writes in this quite simple Greek. You know, I mean, I started learning Greek when I was 12, and John was one of the things I learned Greek on, and because it was so straightforward. But of course, the extraordinary thing about it is that the great words that he uses and the images he uses, they're often immediately comprehensible. But then you find that you never come to the end of it. I mean, light, just take light. Everyone knows what light is. And yet, do you ever come to the end of the meaning of light? And the same is true in one word and image after another of the gospel. And John also crafts it extraordinarily well. I mean, I think one of the most important things in the scholarship of the last 30 years or so has been the emphasis on the literary quality of John's gospel and how it is crafted so as to give us that sense that we both get something first time. It's for beginners, but it's also for the more experienced. And I think my overall aim in my commentary and in that little book, Meeting God in John, was to encourage people to become habitual rereaders of John, as I am. That because it's always fruitful. The superabundance is there.
Yes, I know. I love that use of superabundance throughout your text in this book. Is a beautiful way of trying to do what in certain ways Paul in his own way does, which is hyperbolize, but with rich meaning, not just with extravagance, but with a sense that
Yes.
it's impossible to overstate that sort of richness. It's
Yes,
really quite
yes,
beautiful.
Yes.
So I want to start really with the title, because I think it makes sense of John, but also because I think it's such a profound thing. It's not just the study of John or the reading of John. You're saying meeting God in John, or having this encounter. Why is that title so appropriate in your view? And what kind of meeting is it that John provides?
My goodness me. Well, I mean, to take the prologue that we've just heard, that it both gives a framework for all reality, as you suggested. and that's one of the deepest conceivable meaning, the word that was God. The God and all reality, and the word through whom all things were made. And that encourages us to stretch our minds and our imaginations and everything we have in order to comprehend that. And then at the very end of the prologue, it's the Son who is close to the Father's heart, which is the deepest love that there is, the love to which we owe the whole of reality. But then at the center, John is wonderful about giving a big horizon and then absolutely centering on Jesus, the one who unites the meaning and the love. And I think that quality of being able to focus on who Jesus is as the utterly central thing, while yet saying that Jesus is utterly one with God and utterly one with us. That's the secret, the deepest secret of John, I think. And of course, it's why this prologue has been probably the most influential short text in the whole history of Christian thought.
Right. It is just such a remarkable set of affirmations. I've often tried to imagine the experience that John must have had in writing that text. There must have been a very special sense of laying out something that was as mind and soul bending and enlarging as it actually is.
Yes.
It's a remarkable piece of writing.
I suspect he probably wrote it last, like most of us write our introductions last.
Yes, right. Yes. So what is meeting God? I'm asking that, not meaning it really as an abstract question, really quite the opposite. It's more, what does it mean to be able to meet God? And what does John mean about being able to meet God? Especially understanding and writing this text in which the people that are going to be readers and hearers of this text are going to be people at some remove from the actual experience of being with Jesus. So it's clearly not about a meeting in one sense, obviously a quote, in-person meeting, but in another way, it's absolutely about an in-person meeting. It's about grounded existential experience of knowing and meeting God. How does John understand what that meeting means post-resurrection, post-ascension?
Well, I think one of the most remarkable parts of John's Gospel is where, for the first time, he addresses us readers. At the very end of chapter 20, he addresses us readers, and it says, and what it says in that little passage is terribly important, but also just what preceded it. Let me just read the passage first of all, because it is so important. That here he is. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. And I think what that signifies is John knew all sorts of other accounts, I think both oral and written. I think he knew the synoptic gospels as well. Scholars differ on that. And what he's doing is he's selecting from those. He's not including everything he knows. He's selecting, and he's selecting the essentials for two purposes. John is a gospel, I think, of the essentials. And so the first essential is these are written so that you, so it's the address to us readers, may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So coming to believe, meeting, that's the beginner side of John's gospel. But then the second one is that through believing, and of course believing fundamentally in our culture, I think should be translated as trusting. Of course it means believing, it means having faith, but trusting is and of course what John is trying to do is to trust this person. So that's the meeting with God in John is through trusting Jesus. Trusting, of course, first the testimony that John gives, but then you notice what just preceded that. It's fascinating to me that the preceding it was the meeting with Thomas, and Thomas didn't trust what the other disciples had told him. And when Jesus did appear to him, then he immediately gave the climactic theological statement of the gospel, my Lord and my God. And in other words, that he is saying, this is meeting God, this is meeting through Jesus. But then what Jesus says is, you've had to see me in order to believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. And of course, what he then immediately addresses us as readers. In other words, blessed are those who read. Blessed are those who have not seen. We are among those who have not seen. And so we are blessed if we read and trust this testimony. And because Jesus is the one who is one with God, then of course we are reading always in the presence of the one we're reading about. So therefore, we are reading our way deeper and deeper into relationship with Jesus, who is one with God. And I think that's an astonishing thing to think, that every time we read this, as we are now, we are in the presence of the one we are talking about. And what these words are meant to do is to lead us deeper and deeper and deeper into that relationship.
Yes, yes. I think one of the things that always marvels me about the Gospel of John is the way that it is both so exquisite and yet not unreachable. It's that dynamic between the two things. And on the one hand, it feels like this is perhaps some of the most beautiful action that has ever happened in the world. These are some of the most exquisite words. And yet it all, as you said earlier, it all feels very astonishingly approachable and comprehensible and engaging, as opposed to something that would make you think it's pristine and set up high and far away. It actually feels quite the opposite, like it's much more intimate and accessible and, in that sense, knowable.
Yes, exactly.
What do we know about the orality related to John in the early centuries of the church? I mean, the Gospels were written, obviously this is quite self-consciously a gospel that was being written as a testimony to Jesus, and it would have been shared in that way. But while oral culture was still the dominant culture of the day, what do we know about the transmission of John and how it got passed on?
Well, as far as I know, I mean, people didn't read silently in those days. You know, that the first person we get who reflects on that, I think, is Augustine, you know.
Yes,
that,
right.
You know, how strange it was to see somebody reading, but not aloud.
Yes.
And so, you know, reading aloud was always the case. And of course, texts like this in a culture that was only partly literate would have been, you know, read aloud, of course, all the time. I'm a classicist, you know, by training, Greek and Latin classics. And, you know, it's very, very important that this was an oral rhetorical culture, you know, where it, you know, the word, that I think is also a secret why John puts the word as a headline in his gospel. You know, the first concept is the word, and he was wanting this to resonate right through the culture. You know, word is a word that's both significant in the Jewish tradition that he came from, but also in the wider culture. So it's intercultural theology, really, to have the word as your headline. And in the church, of course, one of the lovely things I think about the work of Frances Young, who's my favorite patristic scholar, you know, about the early church, is she says that sometimes it's forgotten that the nearest sort of community to the church was really, of course, it was the synagogue to some extent, but it was really a school. You know, that Christianity really made a great emphasis on learning, and it had many of the characteristics of a school. And John's gospel just has everything that it takes to be an ideal textbook, you know, something that the beginners can read and understand, and everyone else who hears it can go deeper and deeper and memorize it, of course, too. Memory was absolutely crucial in that oral culture.
Yes. So I'm wondering then how you put all of that together with the fact that, as you are well acquainted, the debates that go on about the questions of knowledge, epistemology more broadly, but really in particular, the theological questions of what is the character of theological knowing. And I just wonder if you could distinguish the kind of knowing that you think John offers in distinction from, let's say, the synoptics?
Oh, goodness. I mean, the main kind of knowing, of course, is in common with the synoptics, which is knowing that comes through testimony. That all four of the Gospels are essentially testimony. And I think one very interesting way in which John does knowing is the way he resonates with Old Testament texts. Now, that also is the case, of course, in the synoptics, but John somehow is more immersed in them. There are less explicit quotations in John and more a sense of complete immersion. In other words, that he's continually inviting you deeper into the scriptures of Jesus as well at the same time. And that's a form of knowing that is very interesting. It's a sort of analogical knowing, if you like. But also, John has an extraordinary imagination, that if you think of how he positions the great images of light, of bread, of shepherd, of, light and dark, and so on, that he's wanting you to have an imagination that is shaped by these images and by the way in which they're dealt with scripturally. And one of the things that I think John does best of the Gospels is have to use your own word of an ecology, earlier on, that he has an ecology of faith that has many dimensions to it. And questions are particularly important in his. The first thing that Jesus says, the word of God says in John's Gospel, is a question. What are you looking for? What do you desire? And in a sense, desire, and what one calls in Greek the optative mood, of desire, is the embracing mood of the whole gospel. It climaxes in John 17 in Jesus' extraordinary prayer where he pours out his desire. So there's questions, there's desire, the optative mood, there's imperatives, of course, that are very important, to love one another and so forth. But above all, not above all, I think the desire is above all, but there's the subjunctive mood, the mood of maybe and the mood of imagination. John is trying to open up our imagination to actually inhabit the world of the prologue. So that we're inhabiting a Christian worldview that is about God and all reality, and about love at the heart of that reality, and that all of it comes together in his extraordinary portrayal of Jesus, which I think is the most matured Christology of the four Gospels.
Right. It's such a beautiful expression you just gave to what that kind of knowing is about. And it is so striking that it starts with this cosmological landscape, if you want to call it that. And then it moves to almost an endless series of close-up shots, cinematically speaking, where it feels like the camera lens is always dialed in to the particular and to the specific. And it's that combination that, to me, has always been so hyper energizing about John's gospel. On the one hand, you're imaginatively invited, as you say, to think as big and broadly, as sweepingly as any human being could possibly comprehend. And then we are suddenly in the midst of a place where a roof is being torn apart and a body is being lowered down in front of Jesus, right? It's the sweep of that is so extraordinary about the Gospel of John. I wonder if you want to comment on that bandwidth. I mean, when I think of the poetry, for example, of George Herbert, someone who I've greatly admired, he has this built into his own theology and poetry, this stretching of the horizons of the universe, and then this great particularity. I guess I'm just trying to understand philosophically, experientially as well, how we hold those great themes together in the way that John does in our own practice. because I certainly can think of many people who live with a functional deism, a kind of awareness that there, and even confidence there may be a God, but who don't imagine that God to have ever come close, or to be close, or to be a person as opposed to an abstraction. And John absolutely sees these things as one whole. So I guess I'm thinking about the way that the Gospel of John can be of special value at a time when I think there's a lot of theological confusion, but also a lot of separation and distinction, which puts the biggest statements about God almost in opposition to the most personal things that we might wish to be true about God.
Yes, and he does. You're so right. He absolutely combines those two. And I think, I mean, for me, the basic practice is that of rereading and rereading and rereading. And the more you get in, that's why I put in the back of my book a reading, that something from Alan Eccleston, one of my favorite commentators on John, who says, read John every 90 days, use them like the Psalms have been used in the Christian tradition. And I do that, actually. Our vicar, when we had a trial run of the Lent book in our parish, she duplicated that for all the parish, and encouraged them to read John every 90 days. And right. I think I'm on about my 12th read through at the moment. And it's, the point is, it's always fruitful. And you never know. John is it's like poetry, like George Herbert's poetry, that you never know what the situation you're in now, this time round, and then the situation you're in next time round, the things you're thinking about, the other texts you've been reading, the parts of the part of time of the church year you're in, whether there is war happening as there is right now, and the fruitfulness. And I think John's theology of the Spirit is very interesting. That the Spirit for John is when Jesus breathes the Spirit into his disciples, he says, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. And what that means is that we've to, I think, go as deep as possible into Jesus and his relationship to his Father and what that sending meant. In other words, we've to read and reread and reread. And also deeper into community together, because it's a plural commission. It's our vocation as Christians. But also we're sent into the world, and therefore we've to engage with all those things that are there and be really realistic about. But the as in that, I think as is one of the most profound words in John's Gospel. We've to love one another as he loved us. And that as is the license for endless improvisation, fresh improvisation. We're not in the same situation that Jesus was in, so we're not doing the same things. We're not meeting the same people. So therefore, every single day is fresh, and every single day is a fresh improvisation in the Spirit on this particular text. And it is quite astonishing, I think, how capacious the text is in that way. That it's, and of course it leads you into all these other texts as well, all the texts of the Bible. But actually one of the things that was extraordinary experience for me while writing the commentary, I started the commentary in 2000 and it was finished in 2021. But between 2008 and 2018, my closest friend, who is a poet, Micheál O'Shiel, an Irish poet, now living in New York, actually. And he's spelt, by the way, O''Siadhail, which nobody could guess from the pronunciation.
Right.
But Micheál was writing his extraordinary book, The Five Quintets, which is 5 long poems on each of 5 themes. The first on and going from early modernity up to now and looking ahead as well, and it's published by Baylor University Press in the States. And the first one is called is called Making, and that's on the arts, including George Herbert, a wonderful piece on George Herbert. The next one is on economics, on a whole series of economics, culminating with his Heaven of Economics, who are the key economists. Then the next one is on politics, and the next one is on the sciences, and the next one, finally, is on philosophy and theology. Now, he is my first reader of all my theology, and I am his first reader of all his poetry. And we've been doing this for over 50 years.
Wow.
And for me, seeing his writing of that, as he was reading all my stuff on John, and I was reading all his stuff on all of that, the whole contemporary world, it felt like he was writing a contemporary improvisation on the prologue of John. You know, that in other words, this was God in relation to all things. And it culminates like Dante in a vision of God as well. And, you know, you ask, you know, how all that goes together. And his poetry is, for me, a lovely example, too, of both that universal scope, but also radical particularity.
We will put all of that in the notes of this show so that people can actually track that down. That sounds amazing. I look forward to doing so myself. I wonder if we could move now to what you have said, and I think many would agree, is the theological high point in a certain way after the prologue. It's really John 17. And these two texts together are maybe the tent posts that end up shaping so much else of what happens in the Gospel of John and how it's described. So maybe you could begin again by giving us a reading from John 17, and then let's talk about that text, because you talk about it so meaningfully in meeting God and John.
Well, I think every verse in this is important. So
Indeed.
I will read the whole thing. I mean, if you want to, just cut it too. But here comes.
No, please do.
After Jesus had spoken these words, he looked up to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, so that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all people, to give eternal life to all whom you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I glorified you on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. So now, Father, glorify me in your own presence, with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed. I have made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. For the words that you gave to me, I have given to them, and they have received them, and know in truth that I came from you, and that they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I have been glorified in them. And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one, as we are one. While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost, except the one destined to be lost, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and I speak these things in the world, so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, so that they also may be sanctified in truth. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me, and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one, as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me. Father, I desire that those also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory, which you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Righteous Father, the world does not know you, but I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them.
It's just such an amazing text. I remember as a college student reading that for the first time and being aware, again, with no formal education whatsoever in the New Testament, but being bowled over by these two texts, by the prologue and then by John 17. I felt I had somehow stumbled into an unknown, to me, up to then, secret garden of where life was supposed to be lived, that I was just beginning to start grasping as a late teenager, and how much that has changed me over the years. I know this is a bold thing to say to someone that I don't know any better than we know one another, but I do want to comment that one of the things about your writing, and I've read a number of things that you've written, including this book, Meeting God in John, is that there's a sense that John 17 has really not just been an object of study, but a life that has been pumped into you in a certain way through the reality of what's being described. And your writing, therefore, isn't just the writing of a very fine scholar, but it's the writing of a person whose life is animated by the things that are actually in the text. And I just want to make that observation, not to make you self-conscious, but to say this is the force of John to me. And the fact that you've spent as many decades as you have on John, and that you write and speak about John in a way that feels animated by the life that John is pointing to, including John 17, is really a wonderful, wonderful gift. And I'm just grateful for God's faithfulness in your life for that to be so.
Well, it has been an extraordinary thing to enter into that. I came relatively late to John 17. You know, I mean, it really came home in a remarkable series of readings of John when Richard Hayes, one of my favorite New Testament scholars, and Richard Bauckham were both in Cambridge at the same time in 2009. And I invited them to read John's Gospel with me. And so we had 21 dates of 3 hours each in my room in the Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge, doing one chapter of John every 3 hours. And you can just imagine those two profound New Testament scholars, very different from each other. So when they agreed on things, I thought it was probably true. But when we came to John 17, both of them agreed this is a midrash on the Lord's Prayer. It's an improvisation on the Lord's Prayer. And that it both focused my mind for the first time really profoundly on this chapter, but also it changed my whole way of praying the Lord's Prayer. And I include an appendix in the book, Meeting God in John, on this. But when you think of it, to change your way of praying the Lord's Prayer, if you pray it like me and many others, at least once daily, is an astonishing transformation, and that has continued. And this remarkable chapter, it is now my favorite chapter in the Bible, undoubtedly, and one that I don't anticipate getting to the bottom of, this side of the grave. I just feel that it is the ultimate in depth and richness as well as breadth.
Yes.
And and it goes on being generative. It's astonishing. Yes.
I wonder if you could comment in light of that power and life that you're describing. One way of reading that chapter is with tears on your knees in brokenness, because it feels as though the church has moved in so many ways that are completely the opposite of the prayer and the way that Jesus longs for the people of God to know one another and to know God together with one another. When you read it in sorrow and lament, what does John 17 offer to you or to a reader when you're so aware in reading that chapter that it feels so far away from the lived history of the church? Not completely, of course not, but certainly speaking as a person who's a United States citizen at a time when the church feels to me like it's something like a 5-alarm fire, I don't read John 17 and think, this is the picture of the church in America. But I also know enough about the church around the world to be aware that there's plenty of places where that's not true. So how does John, at that kind of reading, speak to you?
Well, the first thing is that I think this unity is a gift before it's a task. In other words, that what Jesus is saying is that this unity is already a reality in him and his Father in the Spirit. That this is the truth of reality, and one has to hold on to that with incredible patience and perseverance and lament and so forth. And for me, I emerged, well, you never emerge from the Gospel of John, but from writing the commentary with a completely renewed passion for Christian unity, that what the vision of Jesus, the deepest desire of Jesus, the ultimate desire, at the climax, just before he goes to his death, after he's given his deepest teaching in the whole gospel, that the desire of Jesus is for this utter unity in love with himself and his Father and with each other for the sake of the world. The word world occurs 16 times in that prayer. And Jesus was sent into the world in love. And I think, we in the church, if we don't make a priority of this unity in love with Jesus and his Father and with each other, then we don't serve the world well either. And actually, I did a very practical thing over the last few years. I'm co-chair of the Rose Castle Foundation in Cumbria. We've renovated a castle, an 800-year-old castle, and we have a ministry of reconciliation, and we do programs. And a lot of our programs are in the States, actually. But in the Rose Castle Foundation, we were doing these programs, and we were always using the practice of scriptural reasoning, which was a practice crossing over religious divides, especially in our case, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which was a very effective thing. I was involved in the beginning of that in the early 1990s, and of course, reading John's Gospel with Muslims and Jews has been a very important part of my of the lead into the commentary. But what we were finding in our Rose Castle events was that Christians were on both sides of conflicts, and that churches were divided and were asking for, reconciliation programs. And so what we decided was we needed a practice of Bible reading that crossed over Christian divides. And so we started developing biblical reasoning, as we're calling it. And just in the last few years, we had a program funded by the MacDonald Agape Foundation in 4 universities in Aberdeen, Durham, Oxford and Cambridge, with 50 Christian academics from 7 different denominations, just trying to work out a practice of biblical reasoning across Christian divisions. Now, we're also doing it in all sorts of other settings, and it's happening in some grassroots locations. But I think, that in order to try to deal with the deep divisions among Christians and the terrible scandal that is, I find in that prayer, not least, and of course in the prologue, hope in the word. That actually, can we actually find ways of reading the Bible together? And we've developed guidelines for doing that we're publishing a book later this year called 12 Habits of Peacemakers. And I'll send you a chapter that I wrote on this, because it's right at the heart of my vision of how the vision of Jesus, the desire of Jesus, might be able to be fulfilled. And I think that the practice in this, that we united with the Centre for Catholic Studies in Durham University, headed by Paul Murray, who developed this wonderful practice of receptive ecumenism. And I say something about it in one of the appendix, in an appendix to the book. And what that does is it gives a way that's very appropriate to Lent, in which when you engage across Christian divisions, your first thing is to say, look, we fall short ourselves. We have our difficulties. We have our wounds. We have our problems. We have our sins. And can you help us with those? In other words, rather than saying you should be like us, we say, look, we recognize that there may be things you should be like us, but what we want to do first of all is to be closer to God's desire for us, Jesus' desire for us. And that has already been practiced now. It's been practiced around the world. But I think John's Gospel, with its essentials, I don't think we should ever even dream of thinking of dividing the church over anything not in John's Gospel.
Right. That's a beautiful
and John
observation.
above all says that the heart of the gospel is who Jesus is. In other words, if you're arguing about truth, it's about the person who is truth. And I think if we lose the centrality of the who question, which of course is absolutely central to John 17, it's mutual indwelling in each other, and if we lose the who question and get caught up in what questions and how questions, then we tend to go wrong. And I see churches doing this, that where they have been wonderfully centered on the who of God and the who of Jesus, and then they start dividing over other things. And, I think we can be deeply disagreeing with each other on all sorts of things in the church. But my goodness, if we're centered, we're a centered set, not a bounded set. And it's not the boundaries that define us, it's the center. And once we are centered on the right center together, then I think, and John's Gospel just says that. I mean, it's so obvious that who Jesus is the central thing in every single chapter.
Yes. My phrase has sometimes been, you should never be more than 5 minutes away from rereading the Gospels again. Because
exactly, yes.
It in the same spirit you're describing, is trying to say this can slide through our fingers and get bypassed by all kinds of things that happen. But if we can live our life grounded in the centrality of Jesus, it's a completely different sensibility about the world, about ourselves, about our neighbor, about strangers, enemies, foreigners, etc. And I think you're writing in this devotional book, Meeting God in John, has captured that in some very inspiring and encouraging ways. So, David, one of the big questions of any interpreter at any given time of the Bible has to do with how a given part of the Bible might speak to a particular time. How does the Gospel of John particularly speak to our time, do you think?
Well, that is something that I have been gripped more and more by, just by its relevance to our time. I mean, one book that set me thinking about that was a very remarkable book by an American scholar, Paul Cefalu, that's Cefalu, an Oxford University Press book called The Johannine Renaissance in Early Modern English Literature and Theology. That was about the 17th century. And what he discovered was that in that tumultuous century, when they for them, the world was shaking just as much as it has been for us recently. And you can just think of it, there was the 30 Years' War in Europe, there was the Civil War in England, and there were large discoveries taking place and all sorts of tumultuous things happening in that time. And what he discovered was that right across the board, from various Protestants, Anglicans, Catholics, and so forth, there was a Johannine Renaissance, a Renaissance of John, as if people turned to John in that time. And it was quiet. It isn't usually being recognized. But as he chronicled what was happening, and it was not just in the church, but in politics, in relation to all sorts of other areas of life, that there was this quiet Renaissance of John. And my own feeling is that John is deeply, deeply relevant to the things we're going through at the moment. We need that worldview of that trust that there is deep meaning, that there is deep truth, and that there is deep love, and that there is Jesus. But also, just think, for example, of the word greatness that is being used a lot at the moment by various people. If one goes into what John's theology of greatness is, John was living at a time when, the emperors were ruling the Roman Empire, and they claimed that they were Dominus et Deus, that they were Lord and God. And what does Thomas say to Jesus, who had just been crucified by the Romans? That he says, my Lord and my God, Dominus et Deus. In other words, he gives that title. And look at the foot washing. What emperor would ever have washed feet? That this is what, he is redefining greatness. And one thing after another he's doing. I mean, when Jesus appears before Pilate, as the representative of the greatest empire of the day, and Pilate asks him, are you a king? He says, you say that I'm a king, but I have come to testify to the truth. That's what I was born for. My vocation is truth in the public sphere. And, you look at the public ministry of Jesus, and, he doesn't change the whole system, but he does signs of abundant life. I'm come that you might have life and have it in all its abundance. He does signs of abundant life that are for everyone. In other words, all the wine at Cana, it's not just for his mother and his disciples, it's for everyone there. The feeding of the 5,000, the teaching of all people, and so forth. And I think that what we are encouraged to do is to do signs of abundant life, to be willing to pay the price. The final dialogue with Peter, he's going to be taken where he did not wish to go. And there's a whole theology and education of desire in John's gospel. We've to desire God and God's abundance and joy and so forth above all. But we also, of course, have to desire what Jesus desires and go the way of Jesus. And John just leads us into a way where also community is absolutely fundamental. And I think friendship too, that I always ask my students, what daring friendships have you made in the last few years? How have you crossed the barriers in our society? Jesus was constantly making daring friendships. And, how do we do that in our time? And I think the whole of John's gospel gives that hope that actually the fundamental reality is that utter unity in love and in trust and in truth with God and with Jesus himself and his Father and with each other for the sake of the world God loves. And that, well, you can see I'm pretty passionate about that. But I think that, Amen. Any of us can begin this quiet revolution in our own corner of things. When our vicar had a year of John, and led it wonderfully, I found. It had a profound effect on our parish. And I think really did go deep, and it drew people in. It drew people in afresh, and it also drew people to go deeper. And I think this quiet practice of rereading and rereading John, praying John 17 in the lights of the Lord, the Lord's Prayer in the light of John 17, and so forth. That what this does is to form the sort of community that has deep resilience and also the sort of patience you need in a situation like ours. So that you take the long view that Jesus is on both sides of death, and some of us will be martyred. Some of us are being martyred in all sorts of parts of the world. But my goodness me, Jesus is the one, the way and the truth and the life on both. Death is relativized by Jesus.
Yes. So helpful. Thank you. Thank you. I wish that we could have this conversation last for several more hours and to shift into your commentary as well as the book that we talked about today. But I just want to say, David, this has been an enormous gift. And I am quite sure that people who are hearing this are going to be able to receive from what you've shared in this conversation and hopefully in their reading of the book, tremendous encouragement and help in this season of Lent, not least in this particular year and this particular period of time when war and wars are at hand on so many fronts, and where the good news of the gospel in Jesus Christ is really our lifeline. Thank you for the way that you've lifted that up.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's been lovely talking to you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.